Crimson Bride horror story. The storm arrived the night before Clara Whitmore's wedding. Thunder rolled through the coastal town of Blackridge like an omen, shaking the windows of the old Whitmore estate, where 100 white candles burned in preparation for the ceremony. The staff had been cleaning, polishing, rehearsing for weeks. Clara's family was old money, old name, one of those who believed curses could be drowned with champagne. But that night, no one slept. Every shadow stretched too long, and the sound of the ocean carried something unnatural with it. A woman's sobs. Clara's mother heard them first, then the housekeeper, then even the priest. No one dared to speak of it aloud. The dress had arrived 2 days earlier, a custom gown from London, ordered by Clara's mother. But when the box was opened, the seamstress went pale. The silk wasn't white, it was faintly pink, stained like it had been washed in something that wasn't water. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in lace, was a single red rose, fresh, damp, and slightly wilted. "There's been a mistake, Mrs." Whitmore had said, disgusted, but the seamstress only shook her head. "No mistake," she whispered. "The thread won't take another color. I've tried." Clara's fiancé, Thomas Grayson, was a man of calm manner and unreadable eyes. He'd returned from the war with a limp and a hollow stare that made even his smiles seem like rehearsals. The town said he was lucky to have survived the shipwreck that had taken his entire battalion. Clara called it fate. He never liked mirrors. He never entered the east wing of the Whitmore mansion, where the old ballroom stood, and when he proposed, he'd done so in silence, sliding the ring on her finger as if sealing a bargain. The night before the wedding, Clara stood before her dress, hanging delicately in her room. The candles flickered violently, though there was no draft. In the reflection of the mirror, the dress appeared red, and behind it, for the briefest moment, stood another woman in the same gown, her veil torn and dripping, her eyes hollow and dark as blood. Clara gasped and turned. The figure was gone. Only the mirror trembled. That same night, while searching for her late grandmother's pearls, Clara found a sealed envelope inside the jewelry box. It was addressed to her, in her grandmother's handwriting. "My darling Clara, if you're reading this, the curse has chosen you next. The Crimson Bride always returns for a Whitmore woman when the sea is restless and the dress is wrong. Don't wear it. Burn it before the vows. Don't let the veil touch your skin." Clara froze. The handwriting trembled, the ink smudged, as though written by a shaking hand. But her mother had already forbidden superstitious nonsense. There would be no burning of the dress. At midnight, the storm grew violent. The mansion creaked under the wind's scream. And from the east wing came the unmistakable sound of a music box. Slow, sad, playing the same melody over and over. Clara walked barefoot across the cold marble, clutching her robe tight. Lightning flashed, the old ballroom doors stood open. Inside, footprints on the floor, wet and crimson, and on the grand piano, the same red rose that had come with her dress, freshly bleeding from its stem. Then came the whisper, directly behind her ear, "You stole my wedding." When Clara ran back to her room, the mirror above her vanity had fogged over. 3 words were written in the mist. "Do you remember?" But she didn't. She wiped the mirror clean and saw herself wearing the red gown, face covered in a veil of blood-stained lace. Her reflection smiled while she stood frozen. When she screamed, the reflection didn't move. It only tilted its head slowly, as if curious. The morning of the wedding, the house was eerily silent. The rain had stopped. The sky was colorless, an empty gray. Clara stood before the mirror again. The gown, once pinkish, now seemed white in the light. Maybe the storm had played tricks on her. She slipped it on, and when the fabric brushed her skin, she felt it pulse, like something inside it was alive. A faint red line bloomed along the hem, spreading upward, as if the dress were bleeding. Her mother's voice called from the hallway, "Hurry, darling, the guests are waiting." But when Clara looked again at her reflection, her mother was standing right behind her, only She wasn't breathing. The church was full. The guests whispered. Thomas waited at the altar, pale and unreadable. When Clara entered, every candle flickered out. The priest stammered through his lines, sweat dripping down his temples. When he asked if anyone objected, the doors of the church flew open. Rain poured in, and through the aisle came a second bride, drenched, faceless, dragging a ruined veil that left a trail of red water behind her. Every guest froze. The second bride turned toward Thomas, and he whispered, "You." Chaos erupted. The candles flared. The organ screamed one long note. Clara fell, her gown turning scarlet as the other bride's veil wrapped around her throat. The two women merged for a moment, faces overlapping, eyes and mouths aligning into a single horrific mask. Then, silence. When Clara opened her eyes, the church was empty. Only Thomas remained, standing still, smiling faintly, whispering, "Now we're together." When Clara opened her eyes, she was still in her wedding gown. But the church was silent. The candles had melted into black puddles on the stone floor. The air was thick with the smell of iron, and something else. Seaweed, salt, rot. She turned slowly. The pews were empty. The priest was gone. Thomas stood at the altar, his face half lit by the moon streaming through the stained glass. But his eyes were not his own. They were hers, the crimson bride, the reflection of that drowned woman, now alive, looking through him. Clara ran. The doors didn't open. The church stretched endlessly, pews repeating into the dark like a mirrored tunnel. She screamed, but her voice echoed back distorted, hundreds of whispers answering in unison. "Till death do you part. Till death do you part." Each whisper was her own voice. When she reached the altar again, the room had reset. Thomas was waiting once more, ring in hand, smile unchanged. "Darling," he said gently, "you're late. Shall we begin again?" Clara's heart stopped. "No, this isn't real. I want to go home." But the candles relit themselves. The organ began to play, and Thomas repeated the vow. "Do you take me, Clara Whitmore?" The gown tightened around her chest, squeezing, constricting, forcing breath from her lungs. "I can't," she gasped. "Then she will," he said. And behind Clara, the mirror of stained glass shimmered, revealing the other bride, watching with a grin of rotten teeth. Back at the Whitmore estate, the mirror in Clara's bedroom reflected scenes she hadn't lived yet. A woman walking into the sea in her gown, a bouquet sinking to the ocean floor, a hand, her hand, pressing against the glass from the other side. She tried to shatter it, but each strike only cracked her reflection's face, not the glass. Blood ran down her hand. In the reflection, her other self licked it, smiling. That night, the whisper came again, soft, coaxing. "He left me waiting at the altar, Clara. He promised me eternity, so I took it." The reflection pressed its face against the mirror. And as the candles flickered for a split second, the reflection wasn't her anymore. It was the crimson bride, eyes bleeding, mouth torn in a smile too wide to be human. The next morning, the Whitmore estate was alive again. At least it pretended to be. Servants moved like puppets, smiles frozen, eyes glazed over. Her mother hummed softly, arranging flowers that had long wilted. When Clara asked where her father was, her mother only said, "Down by the sea, dear, helping with the guests." She walked to the window. There were figures on the beach, dozens of them, in torn wedding clothes, standing motionless as the tide rolled over their feet. Every one of them wore a veil. That night, Clara found Thomas in the East Wing. He stood before a portrait, a painting of a woman in red. Her face had been scratched out. "What is this?" Clara whispered. Thomas turned slowly. "My first bride," he said simply. She stared in disbelief. "You were married before?" He smiled faintly. She didn't take her vows seriously. She left me. unfinished. As he spoke, a trail of blood seeped down the wall behind the portrait, dripping like tears. The painted figure began to move, her head turning toward them, mouth opening in a silent scream. Clara backed away. You killed her." Thomas tilted his head. "Death is such a small word, love. She and I are bound. You and I will be too." At midnight, the church bells rang again. Clara woke, gasping. The mirror beside her bed had fogged over once more, but this time there were 2 sets of handprints from the inside. Her reflection spoke without her mouth moving. "The sea took him first, then me. Now it wants you." The mirror darkened, filling with rippling water. Inside it, she saw the wedding again, but this time she wasn't the bride. She was a guest, watching herself die over and over. Lightning flashed, and when the image cleared, her reflection wasn't wearing the gown anymore. It was wearing Thomas's suit, blood dripping from the cuffs. Outside, voices sang, low, echoing, a chorus of drowned brides, their song carried by the ocean wind. Clara walked to the window and froze. Dozens of figures moved through the mist toward the mansion, brides in tattered red veils, their feet dragging through the wet sand, faces blurred and weeping. Each one carried a candle, their flames unbroken by the wind. At their center, a reflection, and behind them, towering above the fog, the shadow of Thomas, distorted, monstrous, with too many arms. Clara fell to her knees as the walls began to bleed again. "Till death do you part," the voices hissed in unison. "Till death and after." The mansion's front door burst open with the sound of splintering wood. The procession entered. Every candle in the house flared red. Clara stumbled backward into her room, clutching the dress's skirt, but it dragged against the floor, moving on its own, pulling her toward the mirror. "Please," she whispered. "I don't want this." The reflection smiled, placing a finger against the glass. "Neither did I." The mirror cracked. Blood seeped from the fractures, and Clara felt the gown tighten once again, pulsing with the rhythm of a second heartbeat, not hers. The walls of the Whitmore estate crumbled as thunder shattered the sky. Clara stood before the mirror, the crimson bride's face staring back, identical now. Thomas appeared behind her, his reflection twisted, faceless, dripping seawater. "Say it," he whispered. "Say the words, and it's done." Clara's lips trembled. She met her reflection's hollow gaze and whispered, "Till death, do us part." The mirror exploded, and the entire house went dark. Perfect. Here is the final and most horrifying chapter of the story. The Crimson Bride, Part 3. The Sea Takes Its Bride. This part dives deep into Gothic horror, spiritual dread, and psychological collapse, all from a cinematic third-person perspective. It's slow, dreadful, and hypnotic, crafted to leave a psychological mark on the audience. The Crimson Bride, Part 3. The sea takes its bride. The house was silent again. When the mirror shattered, the storm outside stopped mid-breath. Lightning froze in the sky, thunder hung suspended. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Clara opened her eyes. The mirror was gone. Only shards glittered across the floor, glistening with something dark and wet. Blood or seawater. Maybe both. The dress clung to her like a second skin, damp and heavy, and from the hallway came the faintest sound. Footsteps, dragging wet silk. Then a voice, soft and distant. "It's time, Clara. The sea is waiting." The drowned corridor. The walls of the Whitmore mansion were rippling. Paintings bled color. The wallpaper peeled, revealing barnacles beneath. Salt water seeped from the ceiling like tears. Clara stepped into the hall. The chandeliers swung above, dripping seawater. And down the corridor, a figure waited. A woman, in a soaked crimson gown, veil over her face, holding a bouquet of rotting flowers. She didn't walk. She floated, her feet inches above the flooded floor. Clara whispered, "Who are you?" The figure lifted her veil. It was Clara, her own face, blue, bloated, eyes white and glassy. Her mouth opened, and seawater poured out. "You already know," the reflection said. The sea's bride, Clara, ran. Doors slammed one by one as she passed. Behind her, the sound of dragging silk followed, echoing off the flooded hall. She turned a corner and froze. The ballroom doors were open. Inside, hundreds of guests danced in silence, their faces pale and peeling, eyes hollow, gowns torn and dripping. Every one of them turned toward her as she entered. At the center stood Thomas, smiling faintly, his skin gray and slick, like something that had been too long underwater. "Clara," he said softly, holding out his hand. "You've kept me waiting." She stepped back, shaking. "You're dead." He smiled wider. "So are you." The ballroom dissolved, water flooding upward until the ceiling became the ocean's surface. Clara gasped as she sank deeper, the wedding dress pulling her down. Around her, the drowned guests floated, faces blank, hair swaying like seaweed. Their hands reached out toward her, brushing her skin as she descended. Below, a light glowed faintly, the shape of a church under the sea. She landed before its doors. Inside, the crimson bride waited, not Clara's reflection anymore, but a being older and darker than anything human. Her gown moved like blood in the water. "Why me?" Clara whispered, trembling. "Because you said yes," the bride said. "You always do." The sea trembled with her voice. Inside the sunken church, the altar glowed faintly. On it rested a wedding ring, blackened, corroded by time. Clara picked it up. As her fingers touched the metal, memories surged. Not hers, but dozens of others. Women before her, all brides, all drowned, all promised to the same man, Thomas Whitmore. Each one had said yes. Each one had been taken. The curse wasn't born of love, it was born of betrayal. Whitmore hadn't been a man, he'd been a name, passed down to the next husband, the next groom, each one a vessel for the same ancient spirit, the sea's groom. And every century the bride was chosen again. The crimson bride approached, veil drifting behind her like smoke. Her face was a ruin of bone and coral. She reached out a skeletal hand. "Join us," she whispered, "or the sea will take everything you love." Clara looked down at the ring in her palm. She saw her reflection in it, pale, exhausted, half dead already. She slipped it onto her finger. The ocean convulsed, a scream echoed through the water, distant but piercing, and then silence. When Clara opened her eyes again, she was standing on the beach, the tide washing over her gown. The sun had risen. She turned. The mansion stood behind her, half sunken into the sand, windows shattered, walls cracked. It was over, or so she thought. That night, Clara sat by her vanity, brushing her hair. The mirror was gone, but the faint reflection shimmered in the glass frame where it had once hung, and in it, she saw someone else's hand move, a split second before hers did. She froze. The reflection smiled, not her smile. A drop of water rolled down the glass, then another, and from the reflection's lips came a whisper that chilled her blood. "Till death do you part, my love." The lights flickered, the mirror pulsed like a heartbeat, and then she heard the ocean, not outside, inside, from within the walls, beneath the floorboards, the sound of the sea rushing closer. The doorbell rang. Clara turned slowly. The clock read midnight. Outside the window, fog rolled thick across the beach, glowing faintly red. Figures moved within it, dozens of brides, veils flowing, eyes black and hollow. They stopped before the house. The bell rang again, louder this time, shaking the walls. Clara backed away as the mirrorless frame behind her began to ripple like water. From within it, a pale hand pressed outward, clawing, cracking the surface. The voice came again, layered and inhuman. "You said yes. You are ours." The hand grabbed her wrist. The world went black. Morning. The mansion was empty. Only the sea remained, calm, endless, serene. and beneath the waves, deep in the coral darkness, two figures stood hand in hand, the groom and his bride. Clara's veil floated gently around her face, her eyes open but unseeing. The wedding ring gleamed faintly on her finger. On the shore, the villagers found only her bouquet, soaked in red, resting in the sand. No footprints led away. The ocean had taken another bride. Years later, the Whitmore mansion was torn down. A new resort was built on its ruins. They called it Crimson Bay. Guests whispered of strange things at night, mirrors fogging on their own, the faint sound of wedding bells, a woman sobbing from the waves. And sometimes, if you stayed too long near the water at dusk, you might see her, a bride in red, standing ankle-deep in the tide, staring toward the sea. Waiting for her groom, waiting for the next to say yes.